Today is the very last day to introduce bills in committee, so seeing no further from the committee, does anybody in the gallery have a bill introduction today? Please.
I got it. Sorry. Morning, Chairman Hoheisel and members of the committee. My name is Robert Jacobs. I'm the Associate Director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. I would like to introduce 25 RS 1051 today. This is a bill for imposing a fee on each transaction by a money transmitter by wire. This bill will allow the State Bank Commissioner to assess penalties for the non-payment of such fee and providing for the distribution of such fees and penalty monies.
Committee, any questions or objection? Seeing none, it is introduced. Thank you. Do we have any other bill introductions from the gallery? Seeing none, I do have three. We'll start with RS 2025. This is changes to the linked deposit loan program. This was recommended out of, 2045. I apologize. This was recommended out of the interim committee that we held, so I believe that committee will be the official sponsor. This on behalf of, okay. So, committee, are there any objections or questions? Seeing none, the second bill introduction I have is RS 2026, which has to do with racial restrictive covenants. This is a topic that we took up in this committee last year. Committee, do we have any questions or objections? Seeing none, the third one is going to be RS 1042. This is a bill that would ban DeepSeek and any other AI platforms that are under the control directly or indirectly of a country of concern from our platform, state platform. I'm only introducing this bill in this committee, and that bill is on behalf of me because I can't make it to the committee where it needs to be introduced today. So I'm going to assume that we'll introduce it in this committee and that bill will get removed and sent to the appropriate committee. So with that, do we have any objections or questions on that introduction? Seeing none, I will do one last call for bill introductions before we close them. Seeing none, we will close the bill introductions and move to our hearing. Today, we're going to hear HB 2125. It has a rather long title. First off, we're going to turn it over to David. Welcome back to committee, David, for a brief overview of it. I will also, as you're going up there, note that we do not have a fiscal note for this bill yet. But once that's available, we will get that out to all the committee members. So with that, David, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to be back in front of the House Financial Institutions and Pensions Committee. I am David Weiss with the Revisor's Office. House Bill 2052 makes several adjustments relating to deposits and investments of public monies in financial institutions. It authorizes financial institutions, and these are defined in the bill as banks, savings and loan associations, or savings banks to secure governmental deposits in the amount that is above the amount insured or guaranteed by the FDIC by utilizing the public monies pooled method of securities. The bill also prohibits investment advisors to execute bids for investment of public monies from managing monies directly from such bid. Also then allows municipal bond proceeds and governmental unit deposits to be invested at a rate agreed upon between the governmental unit and the financial institution. It also establishes certain public money investment rates. And then it also contains provisions requiring certification from a governmental unit that deposits in the municipal investment pool fund were first offered to a financial institution in the preceding year, and then allows financial institutions to file complaints with the state treasurer upon a failure of a governmental unit to comply with the certification. So sections 1 through 3 of House Bill 2152 are new sections of law, and these are the ones that relate specifically to that public monies pooled method of securities. It provides some definitions there. And then also then allows as an alternative, it is not required that financial institutions participate in this, but it is an alternative to the existing methods to secure deposits that are in the that are above that FDIC limit. You know, there's $250,000 limit per account of FDIC insurance. This would be those amounts in excess of that. So if there's $1 million account balance there, it's that $750,000 we're kind of talking about here that would be secured by this public monies pooled method of securities. And it would be if they could use this method if at all times the aggregate market value on such pool of securities is equal to at least 102% of the amount of deposits as in excess of that amount so insured or guaranteed. The state treasurer may serve as the administrator of this method, or they may designate an administrator to actually administer the method. Section 2 is the procedure when there's any potential default of a financial institution, to then kind of the procedure then that the state treasurer and the governmental units would have to take to get the payout from the pooled money, the public money's pooled method to make those deposits whole. And then these duties of the state treasurer could also be delegated to and performed by a federal deposit insurance agency in the event that the agency is appointed as the liquidator or receiver of any financial institution. Section 3 is sort of some reporting requirements that upon the request of a governmental unit, a financial institution would have to report the amount of public monies deposited in such financial institution that's not insured or guaranteed by the FDIC for that particular unit making the request, and then all other governmental units within the within that financial institution. And Section 4 is also a new section, but it relates specifically to those investment advisors I had mentioned earlier. Some limitations on that, where investment advisors that execute bids for the investment of public monies on behalf of governmental units, they'd be prohibited from engaging in the principal transaction with the governmental unit that is the same or directly related to the securities or financial product for which the investment advisor had provided the advice. This still does allow governmental units to engage with federally registered investment advisors. Just in this specific instance, they would not be able to directly provide that service for those direct bids. The remaining sections, and I will say sections 1 through 3 on that public money's pooled money, pooled method of securities, those would take effect January 1, 2026. So there is a delay in sections 1 and 3 of the bill. The remaining sections take effect on publication statute book July 1, 2025. So the remaining sections are amendatory sections where we actually now provide a definition of governmental units to be defined as the state or any county, municipality, or the political subdivision of the state. And then this is also an amendment there to allow for that use of the pooled method of securities pursuant to Section 1 as one of the methods that can be used to secure these public funds. Section 6 relates to those municipal bond proceeds. And then this is now, they can be, proceeds can be in an interest-bearing time deposits in banks at a rate guaranteed, a rate agreed upon by the governing body of the governmental unit and the financial institution. And then there's also language there that the current investment instruments there in that bond proceeds would only be utilized if a financial institution is not able to make investments available at a interest rate equal to or greater than the investment rate as defined in KSA 12-1675A. And that is adjusted in this bill here in Section 8 to mean that investment rate would be the rate set by the Pooled Money Investment Board for investment in the municipal investment pool fund. And that rate would be published daily by the Pooled Money Investment Board. So now the investment rate would equal that municipal investment pool fund rate. They'd be equivalent for purposes of the public monies investments. Section 7 is also an amendatory section that provides that in selecting a financial institution for the investment of public monies, the governmental unit may accept any rate agreed upon by the governmental unit and the financial institution. It's kind of similar language as we had on the bond proceeds. It's now those specific governmental unit deposits in the financial institution. Section 9 concerns the municipal investment pool fund. It provides that deposits in the fund must be accompanied with certification to prove compliance with the requirement that the financial institution did not make investments available at interest rates equal to or greater than that investment rate. And then a list of financial institutions from which the governmental units requested bids in the preceding calendar year. If a financial institution has a good faith reason to believe that the governmental entity has not acted in compliance with this section, the financial institution may file a complaint with the state treasurer in writing, signed by the executive officer of the financial institution. And that complaint shall be submitted in a form prescribed by the state treasurer. And then finally, Section 10 amends KSA 75-4237 to cap the dollar amount of state monies invested in any one bank at 2.5% of the bank certificate of deposit program. So that it will only be, so one bank is not receiving all of the deposits in that program. It'd be only 2.5% per any one bank. Then also, this statute's also amended that so that the investment rate shall be determined each business day by the Director of Investments in accordance with the procedure established by the Pooled Money Investment Board at an interest rate that is up to 2% less than the market rate. Under current law, subject to policies of the Pooled Money Investment Board, the market rate shall reflect the highest rate at which state monies can be invested in the open market for equivalent maturities. And like I said, those sections 4 through 10 will again be effective July 1, 2025. Sections 1 through 3 effective January 1, 2026. And I can stand for any questions.
Thank you for that, David. Again, welcome back to committee. Are there any questions for David? Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, just for my own clarification, kind of, it seems like the nugget of much of the opposition and why this room is so full is kind of the change in definition of investment rate in Section 8. Is that correct?
Well, I'd probably let, Mr. Chair, I'd probably let the opponents and opponents speak to the reasons why. That I know that is a change that is part of this bill in that investment rate. Yes.
Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you so much, David. Before we get into our proponent and opponent testimony, we're going to have just two pieces of informational on this. First, we're going to have Dr. Emily Bright, Policy Fellow at Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State, to present a study that was recently done. Is Dr. Bright there? Dr. Bright, welcome to the committee.
Welcome and good morning. So today I'm going to present an overview over the report that was created. This report is based upon research such as multipliers that have been in existence for a very long time and have been well established, as well as 4 primary papers that focus specifically on this issue. This report does not recommend specific policies, but just provides background data and analysis to help support policy discussions for the state. So the 4 main papers that this research is tied to beyond the multipliers is primarily from the Dr. Wong paper that came out in 2006. But I'm also going to pull fairly extensively from the 2004 paper, as well as the 1985 and 1966 paper for some well-established models that they utilize. So this report seeks to analyze the impact that local government investment decisions have on the local economies in the state of Kansas. So when municipal funds are transferred outside their local market area, there may be fewer funds available for loans to customers, which can lead to a reduction in economic activity. This initial decline in activity has a multiplier effect, which can therefore further diminish economic activity beyond that initial decrease. And this can lead to lower tax revenues for the state and local governments. The Pooled Money Investment Board, PMIB, has money available from the State of Kansas General Fund and other state funds deposited with the state treasurer. The investable state monies are combined with the Kansas Municipal Investment Pool deposits to create the Pooled Money Investment Portfolio. The Kansas law on municipal funds, according to Nielsen in 1985, was designed to help keep local funds deposited within the local governmental unit to ensure that taxpayers who contribute these funds would receive market yield while also supporting the economic development of the locality. However, interpretations of the current law, along with the advent of the municipal investment pool, have contributed to these funds often leaving the counties and benefiting regions outside of not just the county, the state, but even the country. When we look at the pooled money investment portfolio, currently a large portion of it is allocated to U.S. Treasury bills, overnight repos, and commercial paper, with only 0.52%, so less than 1% of the funds are in Kansas Bank CDs. This reduction in municipal funds allocated to Kansas banks can have an impact on the local economy, the state economy, and the banking industry as well. So I'd like to provide some background on banking. This is on page 7 of the report. I'm just going to provide a brief overview. So the trend in the number of banks we find here in Kansas does reflect that's occurring nationally. So in 1984, there were 690 FDIC-insured banks in the state, but by the end of 2023, this number had dropped to 204. In 1984, Kansas had 216 branch locations, and today they have just over 1,100 branches. Community banks, which are smaller banks, they do play a crucial role in their market area, often entering where larger banks have not maintained a presence. This trend indicates that community banks have successfully navigated the evolving market conditions. Their comparative advantage appears to be increased focus on serving the smaller, less densely populated markets where they help create personal relationships with their customers. So we're going to explore a little bit in this paper some of the changing Kansas demographics. So Kansas's population grew by approximately 3% between 2010 and 2020, reaching nearly 3 million. This was slower, though, than the national average of 7.4%. But 80 out of the 105 counties in Kansas did experience population declines. And we find that the declines are largest in those areas that are least populated. So in the areas that had less than 6 residents per square miles, we actually had a 6.9% decrease. So these are the areas where community banks are most vital to sustaining those local economies. Now I'm going to explore some of the components of the model, which begins on page 14 of the report. So in 2021, local governments in Kansas had an estimated holdings of $20.6 billion in cash and securities. Now this would represent the total amount available for investments that could be redeemed annually. So first I want to explain the multiplying effect that can occur. So this is a concept that explains money creation. The deposit multiplier is the maximum amount of money that a bank can create for each unit of money it holds. This multiplier effect evaluates the result from the ratio of money banks hold to what they can lend out. This lent out money is then redeposited back into the banking system, loaned out again, and this creates a cycle of deposits and loans. This table here illustrates assuming banks hold back 20% of the money. So if $1,000 is deposited into a bank, the bank would keep $200 and loan out the remaining $800. That $800 is then circulated back into the economy and eventually deposited back into the banking system again. That next bank then would hold back 20% of that money and then loan out the remaining $640. This process continues, and what we would end up with is that $1,000 in deposit can ultimately lead to a total increase in the money supply of $5,000, which would be a multiplying effect of 5. Now that assumes that a 20% is held back. Now this analysis considered the entire banking system, but to be more realistic, we're going to consider what we call a closed economy, such as the state of Kansas. Now in a closed economy, you're going to have some trickling out of the economy, so that multiplying effect is going to be diminished. So we're going to assume 50% of the deposited amount of money is going to leave the state of Kansas. So that's going to reduce our multiplying effect from a 5 to a 0.8 if we assume 20% is held back. With a 10% held back, then the ratio is going to move from a 10 to a 3.2. To understand the impact of deposits in Kansas banks on the Kansas economy, it's essential to discuss the concept of another multiplier. This is the income multiplier. This multiplier illustrates that income generated from a certain amount of spending is partially saved and then partially respent. So if we assume $10,000 in Kansas money, reasonable assumptions would assume that 50% of that income is spent. The rest of the money could be saved, it can go to taxes, it can go to other things, but 50% of the money is spent. That money gets spent on goods and services in the state of Kansas, and this process continues to repeat with $5,000, which is 50% from the previous round, and so on. If we would sum this total multiplying effect, we would end up with $20,000 in the end, which is a multiplying impact of 2. So using that income multiplier of 2 and pulling the most recent data for this time period, which is the end of 2023 from the Tax Policy Center, we found an average personal income tax rate of 10.1%. Assuming there is demand for loans in Kansas that match the ability of Kansas banks to supply loans, a new deposit of $10 million that would enter into the banking system, with 20% of that being held back, would provide $8 million available. Using our expansion multipliers of 2, this results in total deposits of $16 million. Utilizing 20% in holdback, this should also produce $12.8 million in available loans. This therefore indicates a 1.6 is the multiplier for deposits and 1.28 is the multiplier for loans. The income multiplier that I just illustrated was also 2, so the increase in personal loans should be $12.8 million, which again would be a multiplying impact of 1.28. I will illustrate those multipliers later on in this report. So this increase is the product of the income multiplier and the amount of deposits in Kansas resulting from the original $10 million portion. Now, only the portion of loans spent on Kansas-produced goods and services contribute to Kansas income. So the multiplier is applied to the Kansas deposits from the $10 million. So if we assume and apply our 10% personal tax rate on that proposed increase of personal income using a multiplier of 1.28, that should result in an additional $1.3 million in revenue for the state and local governments. The interstate issue discussion begins on page 19 of the report. Deposits serve as the raw materials which enable depository institutions to issue loans. Any decrease in deposits can diminish the institution's capability to produce loans. The concern of the interstate issue is the reduction in deposits when local funds are invested out of state or in alternative investments. The multiplying effect only takes place when we are discussing deposits that are turned into loans. So now I'm going to explore the model. So in 2021, local governments in Kansas held an estimated $9 billion in non-committed cash. The bank deposits in Kansas were estimated at $77 billion. That was from FDIC in 2024. But currently, only 0.52% of the money, which is $49 million of the pooled money, are in Kansas bank CDs. So this is only 0.06% of the total deposits in the state. So if we were to assume the full amount of money were invested in Kansas banks, we should see an increase in deposits to $87 billion, or an increase of approximately 12%. So in 2023, the loan to deposit ratios for banks in Kansas stood at 80%, while for those with assets under $1 billion, it was 73%. And this is higher than the national average, which means currently there is higher demand for loans in Kansas banks than nationally on average. So the impact of the local idle funds can dramatically impact the effect of an institution's ability to meet credit needs. If local idle funds are not available, loans may become at risk, or the bank may have to pay higher costs for deposits, and they would pass those higher rates on to the consumer through higher interest rates on loans. Local governments in Kansas generate revenue from various sources. The direct impact comes from two factors: the interest income received on their investment and the tax base. The tax base effect arises because deposits in Kansas financial institutions can finance the acquisition of capital goods. Now, when we talk about capital goods and the paper refers to capital stock, we are not just referring to the purely financial definition of capital. We're referring to the economics definition of capital goods, which would include other assets such as property, plant, equipment, and even those that may not directly cause a tax benefit, but an overall benefit to the state, such as education and training. So when we look at the model, we're going to see the variables T for tax revenue, I for the interest rate on Kansas deposits, I asterisk, which is the interest rate from alternative investments out of state, D is the quantity of local government investment funds deposited in Kansas banks, and A asterisk is the out-of-state investments. So when we look at our model, you'll see that the revenue that the municipality and the state generate is not just from interest expense, but also from the tax revenue. Now, if we were to ignore the tax revenue, local governments should invest in assets offering the highest return, which would indicate A asterisk greater than I. There should be no deposits actually in Kansas institutions if alternative sources were providing higher interest rates. And conversely, if Kansas banks were paying a higher rate, all the money should go there. But we can't assume that tax revenues would be zero, therefore we need to explore the tax effects. So let's explore where Kansas banks and what they do with their funds. So when Kansas banks receive funds, the funds either go, the deposits that come in go to loans or other assets. So this equation helps explore that relationship, and we'll see a similar relationship when we're exploring out-of-state or other investment opportunities outside of Kansas bank deposits. In this case, A asterisk is the change in the balance sheet for out-of-state investments. It's going to be a function of I asterisk, which is the new Kansas capital acquisition. So this would assume that if deposits are not put in the banking system but are put in alternative investments, how much of that money is going to supply new Kansas growth, as well as other assets. Now, we will assume that I is greater than I asterisk. And so what that would mean is Kansas banks are better at adapting loans, better at making loans to Kansas borrowers than out-of-state or alternative investments would. So to determine how deposits placed in Kansas versus out-of-state banks impacts Kansas revenue, we're going to look at two different ratios. M, which is the loans relative to the size of deposits of local funds, and M asterisk, which is the Kansas loans from alternative sources. Since capital is a key input influencing the state's income levels, the values of M and M asterisk will impact state and local government revenues. If the new Kansas capital ratio for Kansas banks matches that of out-of-state investments, so if out-of-state investments are providing as much Kansas capital as local banks could, then local government should invest only where the return would be the highest. But if we can assume that Kansas banks are providing more loans to the consumer than these alternative investments, then we need to dig deeper and explore the tax implications. So an increase in the capital leads to a larger output and pushes incomes up. Since Kansas tax receipts are tied to the income generated within the state, it follows that the tax depends on where the deposits are placed. Specifically, an increase in the new Kansas capital ratio implies a larger capital stock in Kansas, which should result in higher incomes and therefore higher tax receipts. Thus, state and local government revenues depend on tax receipts and the return on local government investments. So the key takeaway is that selecting the highest yielding asset does not always result in the highest general fund revenues. So it is important to remember that Kansas bankers specialize in assessing the risk of Kansas borrowers, making it more likely that deposits in Kansas banks will benefit the Kansas economy. More loans to Kansas borrowers means more capital for production, which leads to an increase in state income and higher tax payments as state incomes rise. To simplify, note that the local government funds are distributed between deposits in Kansas bank and alternative investments. An increase in local government funds deposited in Kansas banks will offset a decrease in out-of-state investments. So essentially, $1 placed in a Kansas bank means $1 less in alternative investments. This increase in loans, though, to Kansas borrowers will equal the difference between the new Kansas capital ratio and that of the out-of-state investments. Three essential factors are going to impact the state and local government revenues: the growth in income and tax receipts, the rise in interest income from putting money in Kansas banks, but then there's going to be an offsetting decline in interest income from putting funds in out-of-state investments or alternative investments. This factor measures the reduction in the interest income when Kansas banks would offer a lower rate compared to alternative investments. So now I'm going to explore the revenue function, which begins on page 23 of the report. So this revenue function is going to explore the impact on economic activity and government revenues. In this equation, the value for the loan-to-deposit ratio in the bank, M, is going to vary. So this would represent the amount of the money that when banks receive it as deposit, what percent are they lending out? While all the other parameters are going to remain constant in line with previous research. The overall tax rate is set. The marginal product to capital is set to 1.05. The new Kansas capital ratio for out-of-state investments is assumed to be 0, and the interest rate offered by Kansas financial institution is 4%, while the alternative investment interest rate is set to 5%. Overall, the equation of revenue demonstrates the net increase in state and local government revenues due to higher Kansas incomes, which would be balanced against the loss of interest income when Kansas banks provide lower rates than out-of-state investments. Additionally, the local economy could benefit from increased economic activity due to the presence of financial resources extending beyond the tax advantage for state and local governments. This chart helps illustrate that point. The graph illustrates the difference in overall economic impact on state government revenues under alternative values for the new Kansas capital loan-to-deposit ratio. The vertical axis captures a potential change in overall economic impact and the impact on government revenues, given the local government deposits $9 billion into Kansas banks. That would represent the change in deposits. This value reflects the potential value of those non-committed local government deposits. Now, positive values on the graph are going to indicate that the overall economic impact or the impact on state government revenues should rise when deposits are kept in Kansas financial institutions. In other words, that means that the gain in the overall economic activity from tax revenues should more than offset the loss of interest income to the state. Conversely, negative values indicate that the lost interest income associated with keeping government funds in Kansas banks is greater than the gain from the tax revenue. So there's that chart again, and you'll notice we're primarily in positive values. So the slope of the line indicates that as the loan-to-deposit ratio increases, which means banks are lending more money out to the Kansas economy, the overall economic impact and the state and local government should also rise. Of course, this result is intuitive. As Kansas financial institutions accept more deposits, more capital is accumulated within the state, which should lead to higher income and greater tax revenues. When Kansas banks retain a larger portion of local government funds, the state's capital stock should grow more rapidly, resulting in larger income gains and consequently greater increases in the state and local government revenues. Additionally, the graph does reveal the break-even value. This is the point at which the change in the overall economic impact and the state and local government revenues would be 0. In other words, local governments aiming to maximize general funds revenues would be indifferent between depositing the $9 billion in Kansas banks and investing in alternative sources. Thus, the increase in economic activity and or tax revenues is exactly balanced with the loss of interest income. I'm going to focus on the net effect, which is the more relevant effect. This function illustrates the relationship between the loan-to-deposit ratio and its impact on state governments. This would be the break-even point. Revenues for state and local governments should increase if at least 9.52% of the local government deposits in Kansas financial institutions are loaned out to support state activities. This is comparable to the findings of Wong's 2006 study. Now I'm going to explore the interest rate differential. The impact on economic activity and government fund revenues is calculated using the revenue function again. But in this equation, the interest rate differential, which represents the difference between the rates paid by Kansas banks versus alternative investments, is allowed to vary, while all the other parameters are going to be fixed at the previous stated amounts. And in this case, the loan-to-deposit ratio is conservatively set at 30%, which is comparable to Wong's study, but is significantly less than the average in the state of Kansas, which last year was 73% to 80% loan-to-deposit. So we will be applying a 30% loan-to-deposit. A larger interest rate differential between out-of-state investments and deposits in Kansas institutions results in a decline in economic activity and state and local government revenues. When the interest rate differential is small, the change in state and local government revenues is minimal. However, as the differential widens, this change in state and local government revenues becomes negative. So this indicates that only when returns from alternative investments significantly exceed the interest rate offered by Kansas banks should local governments aiming to maximize overall revenues consider investing more funds outside of the Kansas banking system. And this table illustrates that crossover rate from turning to a negative value to a positive value, which occurs at a 3.15%. This table demonstrates that relationship between the interest rate differential and its potential impact on government revenues, which includes various taxes. State and local government revenues should increase by keeping local government deposits in Kansas banks, provided the interest rate differential is less than 3.15%. Essentially, out-of-state or alternative investments may need to offer rates exceeding 3.15% above those of Kansas institutions for the state to be better off due to the balancing effect of the tax revenues. I did test the sensitivity of this model. So for instance, the current differential set is 3.15%. That assumed a loan-to-deposit ratio of 30%. If banks lend out less money, the differential will decrease. So if banks were only lending out 25% of the deposits, that differential drops down to 2.6%. Conversely, if banks actually increase their loan to deposits to Kansas banks to 35%, that differential would widen to 3.68%. I also tested the sensitivity of the tax rate. So in my analysis, my tax applied is about 10% less than the tax applied in the Wong study. But if I would decrease that significantly less, so if I would decrease that down by 50% of my estimate, so currently in the study, I'm using the average tax rate of 10%, which is the applied rate from the 2023 average personal income tax in the state of Kansas. If I decrease that by 50%, down to 5%, we still have a positive differential. In this case, it's 1.5%. If I would actually reduce that tax benefit by 70% in my study, down to 3%, we still have a positive differential of near 1%. It's 0.945%. Now that differential is based upon a 30% amount of the deposits being lent out. If I would use a more practical application of the loan to deposit ratio of 50%, even at a 3% tax differential, we still have a positive difference in interest rate, which is 1.58%. So this model is, of course, sensitive to changing interest rates as well as changing loan to deposit ratios, but in all of those instances, the differential is still positive. The primary advantage of placing deposits in Kansas financial institutions, specifically banks that lend that money out, is these funds are more likely to be loaned to Kansas borrowers, supporting investment projects which boost the state's capital stock, economic activity, and income. The key issue is not the exact value of the impact, but the significance of the loss of financial resources from these communities when banks no longer have these funds. The state of the Kansas projected impact under model assumptions, so this is kind of an overall summary. So according to the deposit expansion model, if local government funds were added to the Kansas banking system, so this would be the extreme effect, the change in deposits when maintaining 20% of reserves could result in an increase of $14.4 billion in Kansas deposits, that's if that $9 billion was put in the banking system, $11.5 billion of personal income, and $1.17 billion in state and local taxes. Just to recap, utilizing Haslig's sensitivity model, which indicates that state and local government economic development opportunities, income, and tax revenues should increase if funds were moved into the state banks. Revenues for state and local governments should increase if at least 9.52% of the funds are loaned out in support of state activities. And Haslig's model indicates state and local government revenues should increase by keeping local government deposits in financial banks, provided the interest rate differential is less than 3.15%. So out-of-state investments or alternative investments may need to offer rates exceeding 3.15% above those of Kansas banks for the state to be better off. So in conclusion, allowing local governments to invest funds out of state generally leads to fewer local economic development opportunities, reduced income, and lower tax revenues for the local governments and the state. Deposits in Kansas banks increase the state's capital stock, which translates into higher economic activity, incomes, and resulting tax revenues.
Thank you so much for all that, Dr. Bright. Will you hold for questions? We're going to bring our State Treasurer, Stephen Johnson, up here to give his view from the Treasurer's office, and then we'll open it up for questions for both of you and the Treasurer. So, Treasurer Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and I congratulate you. The popularity of your committee is much greater than I remember in the past. So anyway, but it's great to get to be with you, and I'm glad to share what I can on this particular topic. Just starting off at a high level for the Treasurer's Office, the cash flows are the things that we follow through. And as we look to today's topic, we're looking at what do we have available to invest and how do we make best use of those funds. We have to have a lot of liquidity. So in the world, and our bankers know it far better than I do, it's stability, liquidity, and yield. So SLI is the acronym. And stability is first. We need to know there's a return of the money. So everything that we have is limited where it can be invested into notes of the U.S. government, treasuries, agency notes. We can do the highest rated commercial paper, and the other deposits we have require collateral, something that stands behind those deposits that we know whatever the institution is good for. So stability is the focus. Liquidity is right there with that. Our inflows and outflows on your budget. So you're the policymakers. We help to execute the policy that you make. It is not uncommon to get 400 million more in or 400 million more out in a particular day. So that liquidity is key in how we put it to work when it comes in and how it's there to pay out. Our biggest payout is on October 1st. So the good thing is we can anticipate it. That's about $1 billion in outflow net on that day. So managing the flows are the big deal. Right now, we have some additional flexibility with the amount in the Budget Stabilization Fund. Those funds are actually likely to be there for some additional period of time. So then after we get that considered, we have the opportunity to look at yield. And under the rules right now, we would maximize yield given those stability and liquidity requirements. So with that framework, as we look at what we might do within this bill, one of the large topics is the collateral pool. I actually think this is a step that can be a win-win for many of the government entities and the financial institutions. I've talked to my counterparts across the country, and I would welcome other members that are listening to get feedback as well. The Alabama Treasurer is one who I think has the best handle on this. So if someone has a concern, please have that concern and check with a counterpart in Alabama and help me see what is their concern with a pool that's been running for some period of time. And I'll mention the treasurer's name. It's Young Boozer is the treasurer. His yard signs are extremely popular on college campuses during campaign season. But he is a very knowledgeable person with both government and banking experience, and he built their collateral pool. And that collateral pool was created after one of the cities in the state did have a collateral issue. And they said, how are we going to deal with not having these types of risks as we go forward? And they and some other states pioneered that concept. That one is run by the state treasurer's office. Their annual budget is about $400,000 to run the entire pool. It's different than ours. It's larger, et cetera. The Nebraska model is the one that we've been looking at. That is one where the treasurer contracts with another entity, and that entity runs it, and it's paid for by the members. So we'll be exploring all of those things to look at what is the best model for Kansas, what's the most efficient, how do we look at it. When you get the fiscal note for ours, it is to spend some dollars this year to get started, most of the dollars next year to get everything set up, fiscal year, and then a maintenance of 1 FTE. We have the FTE, it's not funded. We think that's a high number. We think we can come in under that for you to do it, especially if we follow the current direction of the bill, which is to put that on a fee to the participants as opposed to a fee from the treasurer's office. But that's the latitude that I think the bill provides, and that we try and give you an idea of how it would work forward. And I'll look forward to talking to people who have ideas on how that could work or concerns about how it could work as we go forward. But where we can make risk management more efficient, that's where I see the win. I see that being more consistent for some communities, not all. Some communities do it very well and thoroughly, and it's second nature, and they've got the systems and everything set up. Other communities may or may not be able to pay the attention of valuing that collateral on a regular basis and making sure they know exactly what is in there. Similarly, you'll hear better testimony than I can provide on where our current system results in inefficiencies and how much collateral has to be held to support those municipal deposits. And I think that will be a good help for all parties as we go forward. The next one, as we look to the reduction in the state rate on the bank CDs. Historically, bank CDs had been a large part of the portfolio, and as we went into the low interest rate environment, they ceased to be a large part of the portfolio, and they've not returned. I don't know all of the reasons for that. It has been based on the commercial paper rate for as long as I am aware of, far longer than I am familiar with in the Treasurer's office. I would suggest that the commercial paper rate needn't be the rate we look at. That is the highest possible rate. If we base a rate using the Federal Home Loan Bank rate as something that's more well-known and widely available, that's a little below the commercial paper rate. And I think where we're looking at a win on return for the state, if we're able to get the Treasury rate, which is even a little below the Home Loan Bank rate, if I have my numbers right, would still be in the range, just looking at from the model Dr. Bright talked about, where the state would be winning on the highest interest rate. As we get into the multipliers, I don't feel like I have the expert knowledge on that. I think the study gives us a great base to work from. As discussed, if we have the opportunity to look at where that break-even point is, where I'd have some confidence that 1 basis point below the rate is a win. But where is that exact spot? Is it 200 basis points? Is it a number different than that? As we look at, does the increase in state funds have that corresponding increase in loans? Is the elasticity or the demand for loans consistent as those funds are available, and are they uniquely available versus other sources that are there? And how do we make sure that all of that flows through is something we would look forward to continue to work with? One of the great things about the Treasurer's office has been having great partners, and I do see the collateral pool and the opportunity to look at places where this can work as a chance to continue to work with those partners. So setting that rate is important, and again, dollars in Kansas where we can find win-wins is a good thing that we would support working towards. Looking to the rates on the municipal investment pool, again, you'll hear better testimony than I have. Historically, the rate from the pooled money has been set at 50 basis points, 0.5% below the Treasury rate, which has been the statutory rate. That all makes sense to you? Did you get it right out of the gate? It becomes confusing, and it's been confusing in the market where the statutory rate currently says if a bank offers over that, they get the money. That's what statute says. You take that bid. But there's this municipal investment pool rate that's 0.5% below that. And the reality is if the bank offered anything over that and that's your opportunity, you're better off than what we would pay you in the municipal investment pool. So, but that may not be the only opportunity that's there. Where else might they invest? So all of those become the questions that the banks and the municipal partners would sort out to say, where is that? And how do we set that required rate? If we set that required rate, where should that win-win be? But what could we put together that is agreed upon and not confusing between the statutory rate, the municipal investment pool rate, and where all of those would work? In addition, currently there's no way to do anything about if a bank should offer something over the statutory rate and it's not accepted, it's kind of lost. So the bill just sets up a way where we would at least know if and when that happens. The reality is we don't know at this point in time, but it would at least start that ability where we could see, are there issues consistently, are there not issues consistently, and how might we want to address those going forward. With that one in the fiscal note, we assumed whatever resources we would need to take care of that would be wrapped into the resources we were looking for in the collateral pool. So there was not an additional cost on that, just to foreshadow the fiscal note for you a little bit. But those are the issues that the Treasurer's Office and to some degree the Pooled Money Investment Board, there's another member of the Pooled Money Investment Board here today, would have the opportunity to work with as it relates to this bill. And I'd be happy to stand for questions as appropriate.
Thank you for that, Mr. Treasurer. Committee, do we have any questions for Treasurer Johnson or Dr. Bright? Please, questions, not statements. Keep them short, keep them concise. Committee, any questions? Vice Chair Steens.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Oops, I'm the Vice Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, hey, Stephen, or who can ever answer this question. You know, there's a lot of obviously disputes between the local governments and the state government right now over this. So my question is, how much money are we actually investing outside of Kansas?
So if we're looking at what is in the total of the pooled money funds, where that would be invested, give me one moment and I'll get a little closer for you. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if there's more to the question, let me know. Or another question, then I'll start thinking about it.
Are there going to be any other questions for Treasurer Johnson? Seeing none, looks like this is the only one.
Cool. So today, outside of the state would be several. It would be our treasuries, our agency notes, our overnight, and our commercial paper, which is the bulk of what we invest. And there is a lot of dollars there. So in our overnight investments, there is $1.47 billion. And that's what we need on the daily liquidity basis. That tends to stay right around $1.5 billion in overnight investments. In commercial paper, which is our highest yielding over time, the overnight has been remarkably good in the short inverted interest rate curve. There's $2.798 billion in commercial paper. In agency discount notes, the largest amount of any one category, $3.162. And in U.S. Treasury securities, $1.621 billion. So those would be the amounts that are invested in things that would be out of state investments. There are some smaller categories, but that would be the major dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, any further questions for Dr. Bright or our State Treasurer? Seeing none, thank you both. Dr. Bright, thank you for coming to committee. And Ms. Treasurer, you're always welcome as always. All right, we're going to open this up to proponents. What we're going to do, committee, we're going to run long today, but we are pro forma on the floor, so we do have some wiggle room. We're going to break this up between proponents and opponents for about 25 minutes each, and that's including questions. That will take us to about 10:45-ish. If you have a hard stop at 10:30, you can catch the rest on YouTube. And our proponents and opponents, I'm sure, will be available for questions via email if you do have to leave at 10:30. So we're going to give 25 minutes to both sides. We're going to start off with Doug Wareham. He's the president and CEO of the Kansas Bankers Association. Doug, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We do appreciate the opportunity to appear. Alex Orrell, who you're familiar with, you'll also hear from, as well as Mark Schifferdecker, who's past chairman of our board of directors and has worked with us on this issue for the past 2 years. Alex gave his state of banking update. I know, I'll just quickly remind you, we represent 98% of the 199 banks headquartered in Kansas. We also have 20 out-of-state banks that have a presence here. Our industry employs 21,000 people that live and work in your respective legislative districts. We appreciate the fact that there was a legislative interim committee, and I'll say that was Doug's idea. I had a feeling this topic, which is a lot of numbers, formulas, it's an important policy discussion anytime this comes up, the investment of public funds. But we appreciated that there was an interim committee that delved deep into this issue last fall, and I certainly want to thank you for your time on this topic today. We do support House Bill 2152, which strengthens our state's policies designed to promote and encourage the reinvestment of local tax dollars back into the communities that produce those tax dollars. That's why we're here. That's what I believe this whole discussion is about. What's the right policy on trying to reinvest as much as we can tax dollars produced by your constituents, all of us as Kansans, back into the communities that produce those dollars. We believe modernizing policies governing the investment of public funds is warranted, is not only warranted, it's critical for the long-term success of our state's economy, which is largely fueled and by the leadership and financing of Kansas banks. You all know that in your communities. I was on a local economic development board 50 miles north here in Jackson County, Kansas, and I saw it firsthand. Every meeting, every local economic development project, it was the banks at the table, 3 of them we were fortunate to have. This is about reinvesting funds back into those financial institutions that are the economic drivers of those communities. And I hope at the end of the day, when we look at how to tweak our policies, we're not looking to harm anybody. We're looking to make our state's economy stronger and work with our friends and partners, with the cities and counties and other municipalities to get us there. But I have to point out, it's simply a fact that when public funds leave Kansas, when they leave our state, when they're invested outside, especially of the local community that produced them, there are fewer resources available for local lending and investment. This leads to reduced capital for Kansas businesses looking to expand, fewer loans for all of us as Kansans that want to buy a home or a car or start a small business, less private sector funding for local infrastructure and development projects, and a diminished economic activity and job creation. So we believe it's important to invest back into ourselves first and foremost. Now, I know we're limited on time, as the chairman said. I'm just going to mention 3 things. Alex will go into a little greater deal on some components of the bill. But when I look at this, and this isn't my first rodeo, I was here 20 years ago on this same subject, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this really does, there's 3 key pieces here. It establishes the pooled collateral program. I want to thank the treasurer and his team and the municipality representatives we worked with. I think we're there on that issue. Other states, it's a proven concept that's working in other states. I think it actually provides stronger safeguards, but because banks can pool, and you'll hear from Mark Schifferdecker, who works with over 40, I think, municipalities, his bank, pooling it makes him more efficient, which means frees up money so he's not over-pledged in securities and protecting when working with every individual county. That means he has more money to turn around and loan out. So we think that's in Doug's simple terms, that's the no-brainer piece, the pooled collateral piece. This bill does provide greater flexibility to the Pooled Money Investment Board. Now, this chart, and the state treasurer just mentioned this, and if I need to share this, I will. I was just going to look at it, but since it kind of the question was asked by the vice chair, where are we investing? I hope all of you, and especially as members of this committee, look at the PMIB's website, look at their investments. You'll find this chart, which shows, are we concerned about the fact that only 0.5% of our state's $8.6 billion is invested in Kansas banks? Yeah, we're concerned about that. I mentioned 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was 11%. Okay, Doug should have probably rallied the troops of the KBA. We should have been here sooner, but we think we can do better than this. This bill gives the Pooled Money Investment Board the flexibility on the bank CD rates that they put out on their website that banks can bid on. It allows them the flexibility of giving discounts on that rate up to 200 basis points. That's 2%. We heard Dr. Bright talk about, we're wanting to rely on the research, not just Fort Hays, because Fort Hays is just the latest to look at that. 20 years ago, it was Wichita State that did the study. 20 years before then, it was the University of Missouri, sorry, Missouri. And then 20 years before that, it was the University of Kansas. So this is not new, as you heard Dr. Bright talk about. But you know, we're up to $1 billion of money that isn't getting invested by local counties in their local banks in the first phase, and so it's going to the State Pool and Money Investment Board. Well, we'd like to see a lot of that $1 billion reinvested through the bank CD program rather than investing it out of state in treasuries and other things where those funds really don't likely get loaned back out here in Kansas. Certainly not as direct as those deposits going in a Kansas bank. And we've heard a lot about loan to deposit ratio. Our current loan to deposit ratio is 81%. So 81 cents of every dollar that a bank has on deposit from all their deposits is getting loaned back out and stimulating our economy. So I think the tax benefit growth of this, I mean, we have blinders on if we're not paying attention to the benefit of the rollover effect of keeping money local. And finally, and I will say, and Ranking Member Hsu, you hit the nail on the head. There's a disagreement over the guaranteed rate of what local banks have to pay to assure that money stays local. I mean, it wouldn't even get to the Pooled Money Investment Board. In other words, what do local banks have to bid locally to keep that money in the community where it came from? And what right now, if you go online, you'll look, banks are paying to guarantee keeping the money local. We're paying 50 basis points, a half a percentage more than the state pays the municipality if they end up with it. We just simply think that ought to be leveled. Now, when we looked at the research, we had a conversation, maybe we should be getting a bigger discount than 50 basis points to keep the money local because of the rollover effect of keeping it local. But we were not trying to be greedy. We were trying to be reasonable and say, what's a reasonable amount of a next first step to try to keep more of that money local in the first place? But if it ends up with the state, we look forward to working with the state treasurer and the other 4 members of the Pooled Money Investment Board to give them more flexibility so they can consider this research and keep money local. Now, again, I told you it's not my first rodeo, and I'll wrap up, Mr. Chairman. Dr. John Wong, 20 years ago, who did the study that preceded Emily Bright's study from Fort Hays State. Dr. Wong was an economist, Wichita State University. He led their business school, the Hugo Wall School of Public Policy and Business Economics at Wichita State. And he stood up and testified before this committee just like Dr. Bright did 20 years ago. And at the same time, he was the chief economist on the state's Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. So he was the economist that the state, the legislature, depended on most to say, what are our revenues going to be? And he stood before, just like Dr. Bright did, and said, you need to consider this stuff because getting a quarter a point more somewhere out of state isn't as good for our state. It isn't as good for your districts. It isn't as good for Kansas as keeping that money invested local. Thank you for your work and your time. I'll be happy to stand for questions later.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, and we will take questions at the end of proponent testimony. And I do ask proponents and opponents not to be repetitive. If something has been covered already in testimony, no need to hammer it again. Up next, we have Sean Mitchell, President and CEO of Community Bankers Association. Sean, welcome to the committee.
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's good to be back here. I can be very brief, which you know this. I am Sean Mitchell, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Bankers Association and a lifetime banker. So I've kind of been on both sides of this. I was also a city councilman for a number of years back when, so I've kind of been on all 3 sides of this. But in short, you know, I only get up here when this is something that directly involves our Kansas community banks. Otherwise, you do not hear from me. This obviously directly involves our banks. We need deposits, and that's from every part of the state. Our banks are begging for deposits so they can loan the money back out because they've had to turn down loans because they don't have the funding. So that is a huge, huge issue for us, whether you're in the eastern part of the state, the western, it makes no difference. This is unifying across our industry and across our state. Our banks, they rely on these local deposits. It's all a very symbiotic relationship that we have going. And just in short, the whole thing is let's keep putting Kansans first, keep our local funds and our local communities, our local banks back to our local businesses. To me, this is just a very simple decision because, well, you know, that's what I represent, but that's who I am. Let's keep our money locally so that we can turn around and help our friends and neighbors, you pick it in that town, and just reapply that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will finish and stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Appreciate that, Sean. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Alex Oral with the Kansas Bankers Association. Alex, welcome to the committee.
Yes, good morning, committee. Alex Orr, Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the KBA. Pleasure to be before you today. I want to thank the previous conferees for their comments, and I'm going to touch on the policy pieces of the bill and then also some of the process. I do want to thank the league and the counties and other stakeholder groups. They've been great to work with for over the last year. I wish we were all proponents today. That was the goal. Unfortunately, we're not able to get there, but I do still have strong belief in the efforts of this bill of returning dollars back to Kansas. And I think some of these pieces that I'm gonna roll through here today has shown the things that have gone into the creation of this bill. I'm gonna start with the first piece. Doug already talked about the centralized collateral pool. Other states have made that mandatory. We worked to make it optional. I want to mention that as a concession piece that we wanted to make sure to work on to truly have both sides of the coin working together. So we wanted to make it optional. So that's one piece. Other states have made it mandatory and they say it works better. Lowering the statutory bank CD program rate. The interim committee also made these recommendations unanimously supported, by the way, bipartisan, of a 2% discount. With working with the state treasurer, we changed that language and up to 2%. Once again, more flexibility. But the argument could be said that, once again, that percentage should be larger. Adjusting the statutory bank investment rate. This is the most key point of this whole deal. There was arguments and talks about eliminating that rate altogether in the interim. There was talks about lowering it 3.15%. There was talks about doing it 2% below. We landed on the 0.5% below because if the MIP has a fiduciary responsibility and they're setting that, and that's a fair rate of return, why is that not the case statewide? But I want to mention that because there was a lot more aggressive options that were discussed, and 0.5 being the one that we settled. Also, an elimination of the market, and I know this has been a change in position from the opposition, but the opposition frankly said that they did not want to eliminate the rate. They thought they needed a rate on the books, and that was roughly a month ago. So once again, there has been a change on that, and I know they're going to explain that, but I just want to state for this committee the process that we've done trying to work together. Clarifying the legislative intent on rate negotiations, ensuring that home rule is in effect, and nothing affects that. They have the decision to make they have the ability to make decisions on what's right for their community. The oversight for public funds investments. We're just asking for them to submit an RFP and the bids that they did for their bids to show their work. There was talks about going a lot more stronger about freezing people out of the municipal investment pool, maybe even looking at the expanded power group and not allowing them to have those expanded powers. Fines, penalties for not following the state law. Once again, we've tried to thread the needle on the least invasive approach. And the limit third-party investment advisors, worked with that language with all stakeholders and made sure that language that's included in the bill is something that we all agree on. The last one regarding the bond proceeds, I've stated to the committee before in the interim, that is probably a very confusing subject. We've been waiting to be educated on that and continue to be, but I do believe that is something that could probably be looked at a little bit more. I think both sides are still unclear on exactly how that works, but I want to state for the record on that piece, we're willing to look at it. Regarding the process that went into this, this goes back all the way to March 13th last year. This is my testimony from last year, where we talked about the MIP rate. We talked about the creation of the collateral pool. We talked about the linked deposit loans and the holdings of the state. That happened last March. Not only that, on March 26th last year, we held a joint webinar with our state treasurer, Stephen Johnson, on here, with the League of Municipalities, the Kansas Association of Counties, and then here states that provide updates on efforts to invest state tax dollars in local communities, aiming to spur economic growth, support infrastructure development, and improve residents' quality of life. This is not a KBA brochure. This is a joint venture that we did together. Not only that, we have a run a show that working with some of the opponents on the items that were discussed. I've heard time and time again over the last couple of weeks that people did not know. I have a really hard time believing that based on this piece of process that went in. And even further, I actually have the registrant list of who registered for this with 37 different representatives from cities and counties across the state, including maybe even one that's in this room that's opposing. So I state for the record, I hope that the intent and the goal of that group, and once again, the league and counties have been fantastic. I hope that it hasn't been to come at the 11th hour to try and blow up something that's been truly trying to work together on. We stated there's been bad actors, and we do strongly believe that have taken advantage of the unclear legislative policies we have on the books. I have 3 examples of that regarding sending out bids to local communities, where a local community received a bid at 1 p.m. on a Wednesday and was due by 11 a.m. on Thursday, 4 p.m. on Wednesday, 11 a.m. the next day, 8 a.m. and due at 11 a.m. the next day. That is not that is not traditional process. I think that is an end around to try and get away from the process that is set in statute, and extremely frustrating that some of our members have dealt with that, and that has led to some of the frustrations. So I'd mentioned the process piece of it because that has been brought up time and time again. We have been ultra transparent with the group on this, and you know, regarding the fiscal impact piece of this too, I do hope you question the fiscal impact of this, the true fiscal impact. The letter I saw in December by one of the proponents stated this is going to be $12 million. I happened to look for his clients alone. I happened to look at his testimony about 20 minutes ago. That number's down to $5 million. Significantly changed. And I do believe this could be a scenario where in this building, you have a fiscal note that is so large that you bring to the table to try and hurt an effort on a bill. I hope that's not the intent here, but I have to bring that to your attention that I hope you look at the financials very closely. Bottom line, this is about keeping money local. This is about shopping local. All of these groups today believe in shopping local, investing local. Sometimes it costs a little bit more to do business local. We all recognize that, but that is something that is in the benefit of the community as a whole. We cannot let ourselves fall victim to a tunnel view approach to this, that only looking at one piece of the bill, which is the investment income, short-term investment income. We've got to look at the long-term economic benefits, and I hope you see that. And I hope you can support our efforts in this bill. We appreciate your time, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Alex. Next up, we have Tom Pruitt, President and CEO of People's Bank and Trust Company. Tom, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the time to talk. In essence of time, I'll be very quick. As of 2 weeks ago, I did retire as President and CEO of People's Bank and Trust, but the numbers are still fresh, and I will attempt to communicate that. I am a board member of Community Bankers Association of Kansas, of which Sean is a part of, and I stand here today to give you an example of what public funds mean to our bank, and especially last year. So I'll give you some quick examples of what that's really done for us and how important they are to us in our thing. I think our bank is very representative of what community banking is across the state of Kansas. Though our bank tends to be a little larger than a lot, we like to think of our bank as a bank that is made up of a lot of small banks that affect a lot of communities around the state of Kansas. Currently, we're a $1.2 billion bank. We are represented in 15 communities throughout southern, central, and western Kansas in 8 different contiguous counties, 17 locations. In April, we'll expand that with an acquisition of the Kansas Bank and located in Kingman, and we'll increase the counties by 2, the branches by 4, and communities by 2. I think the thing that I want to get across today is just to tell you exactly what public funds mean. I know our time is short, so I'll be as quick as I can. In our bank, we talk about 4 core values that lead to a core focus. That core focus is how do we best impact the communities that we serve? As I said, we'll soon be in 17 different communities throughout the state of Kansas. One of the best ways that we can do that is through our lending program. We are a core deposit lender. What that means is we prefer to lend the deposits out first, and then we use other sources to continue the funding of those loans. As you heard from Dr. Bright, you heard a loan to deposit ratio that she used in her study. We, at this point, are 87% a loan to deposit ratio. So what that means is 87 cents of every dollar of deposit that we have in our bank is loaned out to our different communities. Those different sources then could be from FHLB advances, from brokered CDs, whatever. But we define deposits as checking, money market, savings, and CDs. Of those deposits, we have about $900 million within our bank as a whole. And of that, a little over $100 million of those are what we call public funds. And we have great relationship with our public fund entities throughout all of our locations. But the more of that we can have, the more that we can use to impact those communities we serve. Let me give you an example. Last year, we grew our loans We talk about loan demand. We grew our loans $110 million last year alone in our banks without public funds. And that gives you an idea of just how serious the loan demands are throughout the state. So where are those loan demands coming from? So in our communities, we have some larger communities such as Wichita, McPherson, Great Bend, Newton, Hutchinson, McPherson, Great Bend, Newton, Wichita. In those communities, we're seeing a lot of need for housing. In Wichita, we're finding we have a lot of developers that are really building a lot. So we have a lot of growth in loan demand there. And of course, that expands our tax base. So very, very important. We get into some of our smaller branches like Otis, like Yoder, like Pleasant View in West Reno County. You see a lot of those branches that are in dire need to help their ag producers. A lot of those ag producers have been through a 3-year drought. Inflation has went up, their input costs have skyrocketed. And so to do exactly the same thing that they do on that farm, their lines of credit, operating lines of credit, maybe went from 100,000 to 200,000, or maybe from $1 million to $1.5 to $2 million. The community bank has to be there for those operations so they can continue and keep those guys alive, because we all know how important agriculture is to the state of Kansas and our economy, as is the need to build housing in some of our larger communities as well. I am proud to say that $110 million that we grew our loans last year was represented by all of our locations. Every branch that we had saw increased loan production throughout. In every location, that was true, whether it's Notice, Kansas, or in some of our larger branches as well. So very, very important. Our state treasurer just talked about liquidity and how important that is. You all remember about 2 years ago, this country was rocked by 3 banks that failed in April of 23, largely to liquidity issues. 2 months later, we had an FDIC exam. Guess what the major topic of that exam was? Liquidity. And how are you dealing with liquidity as rates are flying up, accelerating very, very quickly, and loan demand is also going up? What does your liquidity look like? I'm thrilled to say that we passed that test very well. We got through that. But I can tell you liquidity, as our state treasurer just talked about, is an extremely big topic in banking yet today, and will remain so. Every bank is clamoring for deposits. We have to have to support the loan growth that we're seeing right now. Public funds play such a huge part of that. And as we meet those loan demands, we have to have those sources of funding. Public funds, as I said, roughly 10% of our deposits are made up of public funds right now. So I appreciate your consideration of how public funds can continue to play even a bigger role as we continue to add back into the communities that we serve, thus impacting them for the welfare of their communities and our state. Thank you for your time. I stand ready for questions.
Appreciate that, Tom. Thank you. Last up, we have Mark Schiffendecker, President and CEO of GM Bank in Girard. Mark, welcome to the committee, sir. You got just a few minutes if you can be brief.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. It's an honor to be here today. I'm Mark Schiffendecker. I'm Chairman, President, and CEO of GN Bank based out of Girard, Kansas. A lot like Tom's bank, we serve 15 communities, 13 rural communities across Kansas and 2 in southeast Colorado. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. My main testimony is going to be on the centralized pooled collateral program. You've heard a lot about that today, and I thank the treasurer for talking about that. Somebody said it was a no-brainer, and I can tell you, we have experience in Colorado with 2 branches out there. We serve 42 municipalities across Kansas and Colorado, mainly here in Kansas. And the Colorado system, it's called the Public Deposit Protection Act. We've used that for almost 20 years, and it works very, very well. It's efficient. It has good safeguards, and so happy to answer questions on that. We are currently over-pledged in Kansas by over 33% of our deposits. And so the current system of pledging one-off with every single municipality results in a lot of overpledging, results in money that we can't lend out because we have to hold those investments to those overpledged. So I think that's a great program. Thank you for considering that. Finally, I would just like to address a few things. My loan deposit ratio at my bank is 85%. And so I know the proponents or the opponents have questions about, would we just keep the money and do some kind of an arbitrage between treasuries and taking the municipality money? If that were the case, I would not be here. I would not waste your time. I would not waste my time. Our bank as well needs funding to loan into our communities, rural communities in our case. So certainly that is not true that we are selfishly trying to get the public deposits so we can do some kind of a transaction. That's the least of the case. Also, there have been comments that concerns about community banks bullying their local government entities by holding rates over them and things like that. And I'm just offended by that, even a comment like that. We consider our relationship with our public entities a partnership. They are very valuable to our bank, and hopefully we're valued to them as well. It's not a us versus them, it's us with us. And so I want to set that record clear. And then finally, there were concerns about what would bank failures, if somehow a bank would fail with this bill, would some of the deposits be at jeopardy? I can tell you there's never been a bank, obviously, unfortunately we've had bank failures in the state, but there's never been one dime of public money that was lost to a bank failure. And that's because we pledge collateral to it. So this would only strengthen that as well. So just want to dispose of some of those things that are going around. It is hard to find loans. I have the same stories that Tom has as well. And I'm excited about this bill. I really am excited, not just for the banks, but for our communities, particularly rural communities throughout Kansas, how important some of these things would be. So I thank you all for taking this on, and I will stand for questions as well.
Thank you for that, Mark. That's all of our proponent testimony. We do have some written proponent testimony in the S-Drive, so definitely check that out. Committee, you have any questions for the proponents that are short and concise and that need to be asked now and cannot wait till after committee or in an email exchange with the proponents? Coach, question, not comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill, it is just to promote and encourage is the whole thing. So if if you're just promoting and encourage, it's a positive, isn't it, Alex?
Yes, Coach, absolutely. Yeah, the goal is to not, we tried very hard not to put government mandates or anything in this bill. We're trying to create an environment that is attractive for our community banks. There's been some opponents who say, oh my God, only 8 banks have been on that. We consider that a problem. Where do we create an environment where there's a lot more competition? And we believe this bill encourages that.
Yeah, one more. And I know we're talking about public monies, but an individual that buys a CD, do we consider that a deposit locally?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative McDonald.
Don't sit down, Alex. I was just curious. I see a lot of municipalities here, and I come from a place that has 2 pretty large school districts, something I hadn't had a chance to ask you about. But have you had conversations with larger school districts that might have an impact here, and what's the feedback there?
No, great question. We did actually float the information in the bill language with the Kansas Association of School Boards well in advance of this hearing, even dating back to last fall as well.
Committee, any further questions for the proponents? Seeing none, thank you much. All right, we're going to turn it over to, we have no neutrals. We're going to go to the opponents now. First up, we're going to call Matt Eberlein with Executive Director, Kansas League of Municipalities. Nathan, welcome to the committee, sir.
There, you all hear me? Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Eberlein, Executive Director with the League, and I want to echo a theme you can see in my testimony, maybe a somewhat atypical way to start the testimony as a word of thanks, but much as Alex has suggested, we've been working together on this and also with Treasurer Johnson for quite some time now. It may be perhaps somewhat naive of me, but I don't see this as adversarial. It is critical that we find the right policies that put Kansas in the best position to succeed. Some of the fruit that has been born out of this process, we have come to terms to figure out precise language that works on the financial advisor side of things, to both ensure that we have expertise that can help serve as a resource for cities, while also ensuring against self-dealing. As Alex talked about, the bond issue is one of great complexity. We continue to seek information and having conversations as we move forward. I offer that in light of David's exceptional overview at the beginning. There are a lot of issues at play here. And so I know that because of the work that both the bankers and Treasurer Johnson have done, I don't want to lose sight on some of the bigger issues that don't necessarily pertain to the municipal side of things. And yet, as it relates to the idle funds, it is critical that we treat this with scalpel precision. And that's partly why I have emphasized some of the solutions that we continue to discuss. Irrespective of when that 10:45 deadline hits, I don't want the conversation to end, to ensure that we get this right, to ensure that you have all the information you need as you set the policies that Kansas needs. This is not a situation, to my point, as it's not being adversarial, this is not a cities need to have this or banks need to have this. We need to have something that works for all of Kansas, and we are committed to being able to have a role to help make sure we get that to the best of our ability. One point, yes, we continue to have conversations about eliminating the statutory rate as it relates to the MIP rate. We can continue to have talks on that, but the bigger point that I want to emphasize here is distinguishing investment by population. You heard from a few of the different bankers today. That was the biggest revelation as we've had these continued conversations, and partly why we are still striving towards that goal of both being proponents on this. The difference, as I reached out to cities across the state, going all the way to the western border, all the way to the eastern border, and things in between, we have huge differences between our biggest cities and our smallest cities and how they approach things. But again, it comes back to this unifying point of wanting Kansas to be the best that it can possibly be. And so we need to make sure that we are treating them with the distinctions that come by both staff capacity, the dollars, and what best meets the needs of that community. We have also tried to work today to provide you with a variety of resources to continue seeking out information. People with far more financial expertise than I have. We have some questions that come down to the rate. As a part of the study side of things, it is not so much to contest those specific issues, but remain as part of this theme that as we talk to our cities, we kept hearing this theme. We have a responsibility of stewardship and financial responsibility. This is not the city's dollars. This is the taxpayers' monies, and we want to make sure that we are treating it to the best possible rate. We heard on the early part of the study that talked about the system was built that we at least to receive at least a market yield. And that's the piece that whatever balance we strike has to be that point that hits the stewardship mark, the fiscal responsibility, with what's going to be best for Kansas. We want to continue having those conversations, and you have some people here today that can help speak to those points. So I'll turn it over to them, and happy to provide any other information that might be useful throughout this conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, up next, we have Jamie Robichaud. I apologize if I mispronounced that last name. From the city of Olathe. Jamie, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Jamie Robichaud, I'm the economy director for the city of Olathe. And in that role, I have the great responsibility and privilege to manage the city's finances as well as our economic development and community development programs. There are other experts here in the room that are going to talk about the ins and outs of the bill and where we have concerns. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about how it impacts Olathe directly. With the threshold rate changing down to the MIP rate, we would be looking at a loss of $1.5 million annually. That's not based on some arbitrary number that has been calculated by our staff and our investment advisory staff to look at how we invested in 2024 and what would have happened if we had to take the MIP rate instead of the higher rate we got when we complied with state statute to do the bank first look provisions. So $1.5 million means something to us. Like you all, we are managing property taxpayers' dollars, and we recognize the property tax burden that our residents are facing. When we start cutting revenue from the city that we're relying on for infrastructure investments, public safety, and property tax relief programs for residents, it makes it all the more difficult for the city to continue to look at lowering our property tax rate in the future. As well, not to mention that we're experiencing slowing sales tax growth, and our expenses are rising rapidly just like everybody else's. The other thing I really wanted to touch on is that the proponents of this bill have said that it may be a short-term loss in revenue for local governments, but that the economic benefits outweigh those losses. We respectfully disagree with that conclusion. We believe the study in which the conclusion is based is flawed for a number of reasons, most notably of which is that there's no provisions in that study that actually require banks to direct that new investment income back into Kansas. The other piece of that study that I'd like to point out is how it relates directly to local governments, is it relies heavily on new jobs being created and therefore higher incomes. Cities do not receive income taxes. And so while that may be a direct benefit to the state's revenues, the city would not see that direct revenue. As many of you may be aware, Olathe is a leader in economic development tools to attract new jobs and investment to Kansas. We use the tools in our toolbox that are afforded to us by state statute to make sure that we're building a stronger Kansas economy. For example, one of those tools that we use is property tax abatements. Currently, the city has 46 active property tax abatements. That results in a capital investment of $1.2 billion in the Kansas economy and 7,500 jobs. Prior to those property tax abatements, we were collecting about $400,000 in property taxes. With those partial property tax abatements in place, we're collecting about 420% more, or $2.2 million. And so why am I talking about this? Well, it's directly relevant because here in all of these incentives, they have not resulted in a loss of current revenue to the city. We dedicate future tax revenue from those developments, a portion of that, but we recognize that holding back some of that revenue, we are able to offset the property tax burden on our residents with that investment. But in not a single case has the city lost revenue from those deals. And we believe an economic development strategy to dedicate current revenue that we're relying on for our operating budgets to future hypothetical economic benefit wouldn't be responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars, and we don't see why this legislation should be looked at any differently. So with that, that's the primary reason for our opposition today, and I'll let the other opponents in the room speak to more.
Thank you, Jamie. Up next, we have Jeff White, Managing Manager from Columbia Capital. Jeff, welcome to the committee, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in opposition to the bill. My name is Jeff White. I'm managing member of Columbia Capital Management, LLC, a federally registered investment advisor managing about $2 billion in short-term monies for public agencies in a handful of states. We've advised on investments for Kansas local governments for more than a decade. Columbia Capital is based in Merriam. Among our 9 Kansas-based employees are 5 Series 65 investment advisor representatives. We serve as investment advisor to 10 Kansas city governments. I want to be clear first what it means to be an investment advisor. As an SEC-registered investment advisor, we have a statutory duty to put the interests of our clients before anyone else's, including our own. We believe this fiduciary duty extends to assisting our clients with statutory compliance, including faithfully executing on the bank first look provisions of KSA 12-1675. We also believe this duty extends to speaking out today against this proposed legislation that would materially lower our clients' potential investment earnings, that would compromise their ability to manage bond proceeds, and that would complicate their right to be made whole in the event of a bank failure. With respect to implementing an investment strategy for clients, our fiduciary duty generally involves assisting our clients in finding the highest safe yield for their investments that matches their liquidity needs. We are absolutely indifferent as to whether this investment is a bank CD, a treasury, an agency, a Kansas GO bond, or the MIP, Municipal Investment Pool. That is the full universe of options available to local governments in Kansas. Our compensation does not vary based upon whether the investment lands in a bank CD or results in a security purchase. And we have never and will never sell our clients securities from our own portfolio because we are not a securities dealer and we maintain no such portfolio of securities. This proposed legislation would impact thousands of cities, counties, townships, and special districts in the state. And I would note for this group that the bill's text has been available for, I think, less than a week at this point. The implications are weighty and the facts matter. So fact, the current system giving banks preferential access to public funds is working. With respect to deposits of public monies, they are expressly permitted only to banks with locations in Kansas. Local governments may maintain as much money on deposit with their banks as they desire without limitation and without any sort of bidding process. Importantly, as of December 31, 2024, our 10 Kansas clients alone maintained $324 million in deposits with banks with Kansas locations. In fact, with respect to investments in contrast to deposits, the current system also provides banks with more than sufficient opportunities to access public funds for investment. During the course of 2024, our 10 local government clients alone administered nearly 200 bank bids. In 27% of those bids, banks bid at or above the statutory threshold rate to win those public monies for investment. Banks with locations in Kansas that want to take public funds for investment are already bidding for and winning such investments. We found over the course of a year's time that 3 out of 4 unique banking institutions that bid for public funds actually won bids. Finally, in 1/4 of those 200 bids, no bank bid at all, evidencing that in those cases, those banks already had all the public funds on hand that they wanted. In fact, if the proposed legislation is signed into law and interest rate relationships remain the same as today, our 10 clients alone could lose $5.4 million in investment income per year. There are no practical ways for local governments to make up this revenue loss without tax increases. This bill then, if enacted, would be an implied permanent property tax increase that averages about 0.6 mils for each of these 10 cities. In fact, if the proposed legislation is signed into law, banks with locations in Kansas will have a free option to borrow money from local governments at subsidized rates, invest those dollars in risk-free treasuries, and pocket the difference. If that sounds bad to you, it's because it is. This is a direct subsidy of banks by Kansas taxpayers and utility ratepayers. There is no provision, no language in this bill that actually requires banks to reinvest those public dollars in their communities. In fact, the proposed changes to the way bond proceeds could be invested could result in conflicts between state law and federal law that could require bond issuers to leave bond proceeds uninvested. You heard Mr. Eberlein testify that there are significant concerns about how this bill would impact the investment of bond proceeds, and we wholly support that. With respect to Dr. Bright's testimony, I would echo what Jamie just indicated, that 100% of the costs of this bill would be borne by sub-state governments, and the bulk of it would inure to the benefit of the state general fund. I appreciate that may sound great to you all, but that certainly creates challenges for the folks behind us. I would also note that I find the term quote-unquote out-of-state investment to be meaningless. The investments available to most local governments in Kansas include Kansas general obligation bonds, the MIP administered by the treasurer sitting behind me, the debt of the United States government and its agencies, which debt supports infrastructure like Fort Riley and the Wichita Airport, facilities like the VA hospital and the Topeka Federal Home Loan Bank headquarters, and services like subsidized mortgages for Kansas farmers. I would imagine you were following closely the algebra that went by during Dr. Bright's testimony, but she gave exactly zero benefit to the fact that when we are buying debt of the United States government and its agencies, Kansas and Kansans benefit from those investments. In fact, if banks were so keen on the desire to demand additional public deposits to make new loans, they would not be asking for the language change in new Section 7F, giving banks the right to take public deposits won through submarket bids and invest those in their own securities pool. Why in the world would banks purporting to increase the volume of loans made in Kansas need statutory authority to create their own investment pool using public deposits to compete with the MIP? In fact, the typical duration of Kansas investments is, according to banks, not conducive to banks making loans anyway. The average time our 10 city governments' idle funds investments was outstanding last year was 179 days. That's about a half a year. A representative of a Kansas bank testified at a city council meeting I attended last fall that, quote unquote, "We can't give your community members a loan for 28 days. That's a loan shark." I'd ask the committee this: if 1 month money is no good to a bank, is 6-month money any better? I would like to close by saying that I agree with the collective comments that a collateral pool could make a lot of sense. I would note that this bill is not ready for prime time. There are no provisions to actually ensure that money gets back to Kansas local governments in the event of a loss. There are no time constraints that require those monies to come back. There's a lot of duties that are imposed on local governments rather than the banks that benefit from the collateral pool. And in the event that there should be bank failures and the collateral pool is insufficient to make Kansas local governments whole, it's Kansas taxpayers that would be responsible for making up the difference, not the banks that benefit from the pool. Respectfully, Mr. Chairman, we ask the committee to reject the proposed legislation in its entirety as unnecessary, as an inappropriate subsidy by Kansas taxpayers of banks, and is insufficiently navigating the complexities of bond proceeds investments and the administration of a collateral pool. Thank you for your careful consideration of our concerns.
Thank you, Jeff. Up next, we have Michael Ashcraft, Johnson County Board of County Commissioners. Michael, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure being here. I don't get the opportunity to be in front of such an august body very often. I'm on the Board of County Commissioners, as the chair pointed out. We have a group called the Investment Review Committee, which I chair, so I have a keen interest in this. Johnson County actually has about $1 billion in investments every year. The reason we have so much in investments, if any of you are from Johnson County, you know we're in the process of rebuilding our wastewater infrastructure. That infrastructure is expensive, as you can imagine. And by having the funds available to invest and generate revenues, then we reduce the pressure on both property taxes and ratepayers because that money is so valuable to us. Looking at this bill, and many of the proponents, I appreciated their presentations. I would agree that the intent of this, if it is to keep Kansas money in Kansas, it does that. But there are a lot of intricacies involved in the bill that is currently presented, and most of that has to do with the unintended consequence that it has on the ability to defer or eliminate property tax pressure. Because without that interest income, Johnson County, as well as many other communities, would be forced to look at other revenue sources, primarily property tax. For example, and this is just a quick analysis, Sedgwick County, if we had used this methodology last year, would have lost almost $500,000 in revenue. Johnson County, about 1/3 of the mill. Cities of Shawnee, Atkinson, and Bonner Springs, between $250,000 and 1/3 of a mill. And Leavenworth, Riley, Crawford, Reno, and Clark counties, between 1/10 and 1/4 of a mill. Now, that varies, of course, based on a number of assumptions, but it has a real impact. And for communities that have complex operations, large operations, expensive operations, that revenue source is critical to help us keep down property tax pressures. That is all I will offer, but I will stand for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. All right, and I'm going to ask the next 4 conferees we have. If your points have already been made with others, please be brief. But up next, we have Amanda Stanley with the City of Topeka. Amanda, welcome to committee. This isn't Judiciary Committee where I used to see you all the time, so.
Well, thank you today. I will be brief, but my comments have not been made, so it will be refreshing new information for you. Sorry, apparently I'm not tall either. So thank you today for having me here. You've heard about the technical expertise. That's not why I'm here. I'm a lawyer. When I got told I had to start caring about this bill, I do what lawyers do, and I go back to the original public purpose of it, trying to understand, why are we even here? Why do we have bank bids? Why do we bid at Kansas bids first? And I spent a lot of time reading Ms. Bright or Dr. Bright's paper, and I had a lot of questions. And with all due respect to the long history that it's based on, what it seems to fail to fundamentally address is that the legislature's met every year, and in the last 20 years, you guys have made some real changes to law that impact the premises that her paper is based on. Very dumbed down version, the lawyer version of the paper basically is, we get income off these idle fund investments in 2 ways. We get it from the interest that you earn when you invest it, and 2, you get it when it's invested back in your community because it's used to loan to businesses who buy things like capital goods. Those in turn increase revenue in your general fund at the local level. That was true 20 years ago when the paper was originally written. It's not true today. We have passed state law, several state laws that have exempted from ad valorem tax equipment, machinery, business good, capital goods. So we are no longer receiving property tax that goes into the general fund directly when those monies are used to buy capital goods. It doesn't explain how we get income at the local level from education or training. It does say that increased income taxes filters down through the local level. That also was true 20 years ago when the Wong paper was written, because we had the LAVTR that then took the increased income tax and helped distribute it to the local level to decrease property taxes. So when you combine those 2 things, there are some real unanswered questions about the validity of this 3.15% that you have to get higher returns on outside the state in order to accomplish this. I have emailed Dr. Bright these questions to ask how she has accounted for those changes in law, because the paper makes no references to them at all and seems to imply that they are still current law. So I just think anytime you look at altering fundamental public policy, that we have an obligation to take a look back and say, is it still good public policy? Cities didn't bring this bill to you. We weren't looking to tinker with it. But if the bankers are going to tinker with it, then we should all make sure that it is still good public policy in what we are doing. Because the paper fundamentally says if those increased returns that you're getting from investment are not greater than the interest rate, then you should bid at the higher rate and get those monies back, because that directly decreases your tax burden. So it's also not accounted for how do higher property taxes based off that lost revenue impact the very businesses that are bringing these monies in. There's just a lot of unanswered questions, and I think that those are things that I would truly hope this committee has the author of the study explain, because I truly would love to know how that's all being accounted for. And I'm happy to stand for questions.
I appreciate that, Amanda, and I appreciate you being brief. Up next, we have Jason Hanneman, Finance Director for Prairie Village. Jason, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Jason Hanneman. I am the Finance Director for the City of Prairie Village, and I'm here today asking you that you oppose House Bill 2152 as currently written and representing the cities of Prairie Village, Merriam, Mission, Roland Park, and Westwood Hills. I'm going to scrap most of what I had written here, just to be brief and say that the City of Prairie Village has excellent relationships with its main bankers, the bankers who have bid and won our funds. But we have a problem in particular with the lowering of the rate, the forced acceptance of a rate that is lower than a market rate of return we can otherwise receive. As calculated, the City of Prairie Village would stand to lose about $58,000 per year. City of Roland Park, $69,000 per year, and the City of Merriam over $273,000 per year, which is over 1 mill's worth of property tax equivalent. I would say that, to put it in a different context, if you were proposing a program if you were running for city council and you knocked on a voter's door and you said, what I intend to do if I get elected is to take 1 mil of our property taxes and give it to our wonderful local banks, and that will help grow our economy. I think that voter, when you asked for their vote, as you wrapped up, would they shake your hand or would they slam the door in your face? I think that the forced acceptance of a lower than market rate of return cannot be looked at any other way as a taxpayer subsidy to our local banks. And no matter how much we respect them, appreciate they're here and the good work they do in the community, I think you cannot ignore the immediate impact on taxpayer funds and that they would not support that bill. So in that case, I ask you to stand in opposition to that portion of the bill. Thank you for your time. I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Jason. Up next, we have Jay Hall, Deputy Director and General Counsel for the Kansas Association of Counties. Jay, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will also be brief. My main focus is going to be on the potential loss of interest income. We have to remember that cities and counties, but here particularly for my purposes, counties, if that income from interest is lost at the county level, unless that results in the banking industry getting that money back into the system in the form of either property taxes or sales taxes, then that income is lost and it has to be made up through increases in property taxes to the current taxpayers. And that is what we're trying to avoid. So my testimony really focuses on is just that loss of interest income and the fact that even if the study from Dr. Bright is true, that losing that income from interest, if it is not made up directly in either property tax or sales tax increases, then that revenue would be lost to that particular county because they have to have that made up in their particular county in order to collect that revenue. I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for being brief, sir. Last up, we have Don Colby, Finance Director for the City of Leawood. Don, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I say hello to the Vice Chairman, who is a council member when I worked for the City of Shawnee, so nice to see you again. I can probably just throw away what I wrote. Please read it. It was meaningful and still is, but I wanted to address a couple of things that have come up today since we're talking about things that haven't already written. The first is, I didn't think I was going to talk about economic models, but since it was brought up, Dr. Wong was, who's been referenced here several times today, was on the Consensus Revenue Estimating Committee. As was mentioned, I actually served in staff capacity and did revenue estimates as well in the late 90s, early 2000s. The thing I remember the most that Dr. Wong would say, he'd come in with his models and tell us what the revenues would be, and they would be so far off from what the rest of us were estimating. And he'd say, well, models are only as good as the information that goes into them. And if he didn't have all that information, he wasn't able to come up with an accurate estimate. And I think that's one of the things here that not being able to take into account all the information that's been mentioned earlier is important to determining what that payback is. And some of you were probably here in the last decade when those same assumptions were made about cutting income tax and other things to return into the economy. And that payback that may or may not occur, but there's so many other things and behaviors can change. So I think it's dangerous to set that up based upon a model. The second thing that I would comment on is that the relationships with local bankers and small communities I absolutely agree that's a very important relationship to have. And some of the things I think that are maybe underlying this is that communities are not talking to their banks. I don't think that's the case. And I mentioned in my testimony that you can't go anywhere in your community, usually without running into somebody from the bank. And you have those conversations, whether they're looking to be able to bid on investments, if they're needing deposits, those conversations happen. They happen at Rotary, they happen at Economic Development Committee meeting, they happen at the football game. So I think it's important, and I remember saying this to Alex very early on conversation, is I think one of the most important things we can do is educate both small town banks and the small town staff and elected officials that the bid requirement's there. They should be talking. And I think in cases where I've been, had money to invest, if it was a small difference and a bank came in and said, I want to bid on this, I think that would be consideration and could possibly be loaned. I don't think I've ever had that. And I worked in 3 small communities over 14 years. So I just wanted to point out that I think one of the big things that may come out of this is awareness and education. I teach the class for advanced municipal finance through the league to both elected and staff. And I can tell you that most of the time people don't understand how this process works. So I just wanted to provide that background from a small town perspective. And from the city of Leawood's perspective, we really don't have a position. I haven't even done the math, but I would agree that that we would see some change in some of our bids. But I also admit that not too long ago, I was investing in the MIP instead of in treasuries because the rates were inverted a little bit. So we do know that it's not always half a point. Those things do change. And with that, I'd stand for questions as well.
Thank you so much, Don. All right, committee, this is what we're gonna do. It's almost 11 o'clock. There are a lot of testimony that we need to go through. There are a lot of questions that we all have for both sides. So what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna pause this hearing. And I'm gonna work with the opponents and the proponents to come back in another day just to stand for questions. And we can have a discussion with both the proponents and opponents because I have a lot of questions myself I want to ask. We don't have time today. So we're going to pause this hearing. We're going to come back at another point, again, working with both sides to get everybody back up here, and we will have both sides stand for questions. In the meantime, we have been working on this issue for a long time. I introduced the bill on this issue last March. We had an interim committee in November. I requested that interim committee in July. We had the webinar. I don't know where there was a communication breakdown, but there clearly was because I didn't hear any opposition from my city friends, my local friends, until last week. So we have been working on this issue for a while. I don't know what happened. I'm not going to assign blame to anybody, but I will say this. I believe there are wins in this legislation for everybody. And I think what's more important to this committee is there are wins in this legislation for Kansans. And that's all this committee cares about is wins for Kansans. So I encourage everybody, opponents and proponents, that in the meantime, until we bring you guys back up here, get in the room, get back to the table, hammer this out. Let's see if we can find an agreement, and let's see if we can find those wins for Kansans within this legislation. So again, I will be contacting both sides, proponents and opponents, to find a date that will work for everybody, that we can get everybody back up here, give the committee time to analyze and research all the testimony, gather their questions, and we'll do question time then. So with that, we'll pause this meeting, and yes, sir. So we'll go ahead and pause this meeting. Before I adjourn, it looks like I need to give some clarification on some RS numbers. 1042 on the DeepSeek, RS 1042 on DeepSeek, 2045 on the Link Deposit Loan Program, .0045, I apologize, 0045 on the Link Deposit Program, and 2026 on the Racial Covenant. .1075, RS 1075 on the Racial Covenant piece. Had a little mix up there. So those are the 3 RS numbers, and nobody else has any bill introductions. Okay, seeing none, we will adjourn.